So welcome everyone to the panel on Beyoncé's Africa, African Perspectives on Black is King, co-organized by the blogs Africa Proactive and Everyday Orientalism. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us from wherever you are in the world and for connecting to this panel from different time zones. So we're looking forward to a highly vibrant and very energetic discussion, one that both shows appreciation for the powerful message and the creative genius of Beyoncé's recent video album, Black is King, but that is also informed by a diversity of responses and voices from the African continent. With all great works of art come socio-historical analysis and sometimes also critical feedback. So first, some housekeeping rules for all of you who are attending. Please keep your mic and your video off during the discussion of the panel. And you can ask questions of the panelists once the discussion is over and when I invite you to do so. You can type your questions via the chat window and I will field the questions and ask the panelists the questions that you'd like to share. First, some words of appreciation. A big thank you to Bright Ackwerh, an artist and a satirical cartoonist from Ghana, and a friend of mine who generously contributed his drawing of Beyoncé for the publicity of our panel. In case you haven't seen it, it's a beautiful drawing of Beyoncé, I think from her Coachella, was it not her Coachella concert, but it's a beautiful drawing of Beyoncé that he graciously allowed us to use. And thanks also go to Catherine Blouin, Rachel Mayes, and to Osama Gad from the blog Everyday Orientalism for co-organizing and co-hosting this panel with me. So now let's have some introductions. My name is Girish Daswani. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at the University of Toronto. I'll be chairing this panel. My three panelists, two of whom I know are here, one who is on Facebook but not responding, who might show up, hopefully Rotimi will join us. So my three panelists today are Nadine Munsami, Judy Ayurozane, and Rotimi Fasan. So quick introductions. And Nadine is a senior lecturer in the English Literature Department at the University of Pretoria. She's currently writing a monograph on a contemporary South African fiction and otherwise conducts research on science fiction in Africa. Her debut novel, which I believe just came out recently, The Unfamous Five, I'm wondering whether it has to do anything to do with the Famous Five, is published by Mojaji Books, and it came out last year. Judy Sayel is a writer and an entrepreneur, and she is a public speaker, and she is an educator. She is also a published author, a regular contributor to the blog African Feminism, and serves as the president and executive director of Choose Yourself, an NGO that promotes race and gender equity through the liberation of women. So I'm also happy to have her here because she's also written a recent article that has really been circulated widely, and I hope you get a chance to read as well. It is in our list of readings for today, in case you have the time later. Our third speaker, who I pray shows up, otherwise we'll just have a wonderful conversation amongst the three of us, is Rotimi Fasan. Rotimi is a professor of the English department at Osun State University in Nigeria, and drawing on insights from literary, post-colonial, and cultural studies, his work explores the theme of national identity that is implicit in the multiplicity of indigenous languages and popular cultural practices in Nigeria. So this is an amazing lineup of speakers, if I do say so myself. And rather than spend the time talking about how great they are, I'll let them speak for themselves. So let's get things started. Nadine, would you get the ball rolling, please?
Yeah, sure, gladly. So thank you very much for the warm welcome, Girish, and hi to everybody out there. I hope we get to keep the session as dialogic as possible by fielding as many questions as possible later. And also thank you to all the platforms that made this conversation possible. I'm actually really excited to hear diverse opinions on Black is King. So because I was asked to start, I thought maybe I would start by contextualizing this conversation. So if this is maybe obvious ideas to some people who are listening in, apologies, but I thought maybe some context is necessary. And so in saying that, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we think about Black is King, um, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a contemporary and arguably very capitalistic retelling of something that we can consider as an old mythological tale. So if we think about this irreparable yearning for the return passage to the motherland, that is in fact a narrative that has been espoused since the 16th century. So ever since the Atlantic slave trade brutally ripped millions of Africans off the African continent, there has been this reversion to the idea of the African motherland as a kind of reparative idea. And so we see that it has, since the 16th century, then developed as this kind of nostalgic and mythological force. So almost as if it has offered a kind of spiritual compensation for the traumas of slavery, and understandably so. Um, and so when I say that it's a mythological narrative, I think we need to acknowledge that it is in fact a fantasy of return that has helped to reimagine an identity. So to compensate for the historical fissures that have been very traumatic, and then establishes a sense of continuity and stability around an identity that is maybe unchanging and allows for a kind of inherited African lineage. And yet also in calling it a mythological narrative, I also want to lay out the caveat that it has in fact been a creative and political tool in movements like Pan-Africanism, for example. So I don't think we can dismiss it outright as entirely superficial in that sense. The imagination has always been very politically useful. And we see this in the way that this narrative has in fact spurred thinkers like Marcus Garvey and Martin Zeleny, for example, even I think Du Bois. And I think it's also inspired the kind of geopolitical dialogism that we see playing out in the Harlem Renaissance, in Black Power movements, and even to some extent in movements like Negritude. So on the one hand, we see that this narrative has been very politically useful. And on the other hand, it has in fact also been picked up by American popular culture. And maybe then we can see this playing out primarily in movements like Afrofuturism, for example. So here we have in Afrofuturism this interesting conflation of a cosmic self merging then with this narrative of a return to Africa fantasy. And maybe I think thinking of someone like Sun Ra is a good example in this case. Where very iconically he sees and imagines himself as this cosmic time traveler who can easily escape the here and the now of almost African-American denigration and travel to other places where he can imagine himself in more empowered ways. So whether that place is, a cosmic otherworld, out of space Mars, or whether that's a kind of pre-colonial Africa is besides the point. It still allows for that reparative function of the identity. And so I think that's important to note, because when we see that Black is King emerged against the backdrop of this recent wave of Black Lives Matter, we see that there is in fact a viability to this mythology still, that it does in fact resonate to a large extent with Black culture in the global North. And so obviously in making that distinction, I think I'm already citing an awareness that there are perhaps people, and maybe in saying that I mean people like myself, who are in fact making distinctions between, Afrofuturism and the way we experience popular culture on the African continent itself. And that's precisely why I wanted to point out that article that I put on the reference list, which is the blog post by Nadine Okorafor, because she very neatly outlines this geographical distinction between Afrofuturism, which on the one hand, I think takes its license to imagine the African continent from the perspective of the West, and then to argue that it's possible to think of Africans as performing a different kind of practice, which is arguably what she does, which is to imagine the African continent on its own terms. And I think it's important to outline that because, it's not to say that to allow space for narratives like Black is King is to necessarily drown out an African voice, so to speak. There is an affirmative space where African popular culture can be practiced alongside something like the Afrofuturism that we see being, I think, espoused in something like Black is King. And then also in highlighting that that's also not to diminish the kind of artistry that we see very clearly in Black is King, or to reduce the fact, I think, that many Africans did in fact feel offended by its rendition. But I think I'm highlighting this because what ultimately then became interesting for me personally about Black is King is that it does then, I think, offer us a very self-conscious admission almost about its own un-Africanness in a sense. And I guess if you get time to circle back to me, maybe that's something that I'll elaborate on in how it actually stages a kind of ventriloquism or a spectacle of Africa to make that admission quite clear to us as an audience.
Thank you very much, Nadine. So Judy Sayal, am I pronouncing your name correctly? You have to tell me.
No, you are not, but it's okay. It's Judy Kayal, but you can use Judy, which is easier, and everybody calls me Judy.
Okay, so please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I think I totally understand what Nadine was saying, but I also have been reflecting, after I put my article out there, I also have been reflecting a lot on what Black is King means. And I want us to understand that art is very much political, and engaging art in a political way is offering ourselves ways to imagine something way better. So Beyoncé gave us a film that tells us her sense of belonging to a continent that is so much wide and is made of 54 countries and islands. And when Beyoncé is talking of motherland, she's talking of motherland as this monolith country, and ignore the different realities that makes this continent. And I think that also has been the danger of when people talk about returning to motherland. What exactly part of motherland are you returning to? Do you think you can still belong in that part of motherland? And I think that also has been the danger, because there's also this West narrative that consider Africa as one piece of cake. And that started with the Berlin Conference, that Africa was seen as a piece of cake. As huge as it was, Europeans considered that something that they can divide and control it the same way, because that's how they view us. So when I saw Black is King, and I love Beyoncé because she is trying to tap into her Africanness. And I keep saying that, and she has the right. She has the right to find her sense of belonging on the continent. So when I think of Beyoncé getting into her sense of belonging and imagining returning to motherland and telling us all these stories, it brought me to what Chinua Achebe wrote, saying that we shouldn't have to create unrealistic realities about Africa for us to connect to the continent. And that conversation has been going on in many political and organizing spaces, and especially in the diaspora. And it's been going on because of the lack of stories and the lack of identity that rims inside us in the diaspora. Because at the end of the day, when we are not part of motherland, there are some realities we are not part of that we ignore. And another thing that I've been thinking of that Beyoncé brought is Americanism, which is a danger to Africa. So Beyoncé is selling us this glorified image of Africa. And Beyoncé is selling us this reality that the motherland is a place that is welcoming to everybody, which is not. And on top of that, Beyoncé is giving us an imagined reality that everybody in the motherland is well off. Because when I saw Black is King, it's an imagination of reality. And what makes reality? Reality is just one family being made up of thousands of farmers, thousands of people who worked very hard every single day to maintain those two people in that royal family well off. And we saw a song in Black is King, actually, where Beyoncé is, Jay-Z is coming home to thousands of human labor, laying outside, waiting to cater to him. And that is the reality that she gave us. And that brings the conversation of domestic labor on the African continent and the people who suffer at the end of the day, who are the girls and women who are exploited into it. And then Black is King, that's why I say Black is King is rich, because it taps into many things. Black is King also taps into masculinity and the danger of patriarchy. But also what I love about Black is King, it brings us to a place where we realize that actually patriarchal narratives didn't start with colonizations. African kingdoms, I'm not saying all African kingdoms, some African kingdoms actually were relying on men holding the power to sustain their families. So Black is King, we see this conversation that Beyoncé is having. At the beginning, there's this young man who says, sometimes I don't feel like I'm a king. So she's giving us a Black is King conversation on masculinity, on what it means to hold power and what it means to be a man. And she takes us through all of it in the movie. And that bothers me as someone who uses feminist thinking to analyze power dynamics on the African continent. Because the Africa we are trying to imagine isn't the Africa that is sustaining masculinity based on an unequal power. Then the other thing that Beyoncé gave us is African spirituality. And I loved it. I loved it because I feel like that's conversation that we needed. And I haven't been able to unpack a lot, but I love that Beyoncé throughout the film, she connects to the ancestors. She is listening. She is trying to learn the ways to be at their service. And I feel like that is also something that white supremacy has took from us, the reality that we can define our own relationship with ancestors, because they demonized it. They demonized our own ways of practicing faith, our own ways of practicing religion. So Beyoncé takes us through all of that. And at the end of the film, Beyoncé, the film ends and you see Beyoncé is at peace. So what is Black is King telling us? Is it a journey to home? So if it's a journey to home, what makes a journey to motherland? And if it's a journey to home that is made of all those faces, where you have to face yourself, face things along the journey, what should have been the right way to tell these stories? Because I don't think the Black is King, Beyoncé was able to tell us everything she had at heart within that film, Black is King. Because at the end of the day, it's a movie about lions that Beyoncé just put Blackness and Africanness into it at the end of the day. And it wasn't enough for her to articulate all that she has at heart. But you could see that it's someone who's trying so hard to understand Blackness, Africanness, African spirituality, and find her belonging. And I respect her for that. And also sharing it with us. But the end of the day, also making some money out of it.
Thank you very much, Judy. And my apologies for mispronouncing your name.
It's okay.
In the beginning, but I think you've raised many really good points, and I want to come back to these points again, perhaps in the next round of our conversation. But I want to move on as well to our third speaker who has joined us, Rotimi. Welcome. You have to unmute yourself. So right now you are muted.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon.
So please feel free to give your first thoughts on what you felt or you thought about when you watched the video Black is King.
Well, first off, I think the first thing I want to say is this, that for the very fact that Beyoncé is trying to give us her own sense of Africa, we have to understand where she's coming from. To the extent that the picture she's giving, I mean, what she's giving us is based on our own experience, our own understanding of Africa. I think we'll be doing ourselves a whole lot of favor to put things in context, not to expect too much from her. She's an artist, not an intellectual. And I think to that extent, we could overlook certain things that we might not feel very comfortable with about Black is King. It's very obvious that she's giving us a Western gaze of Africa. But I think we have to look beyond this to ask ourselves, what is the motive behind this? Why has she done this? The picture we have in Black is a glamorized picture of Africa. It is something that Africans from different backgrounds, especially in literature, have had to engage with over the ages. The question of what type of Africa we had. Is it this Africa of kings, of monarchies, of pyramids? Or is it the same Africa that, just like any other part of the world, that has to contend with everyday existential issues of food, struggles to eat, of people trying to fend for themselves, of slavery, of imperialism? Is it the same Africa that Beyoncé has given us in Black is King? I think the picture she gave us is evidently one that speaks to our own experience as an African-American woman, and above everything else as a capitalist. But as I would like to emphasize here, we have to look at the motive behind this. She could as well, like every other person, or like any other one who, I mean, some people of racist background, ignore everything about Africa and just, relate with Africa in a very condescending way. But she has tried to give us a picture of Africa from our own experience. We cannot expect from her the kind of thing we would expect from, say, an artist from Africa, say Fela Kuti, for example, who had to live in Africa, who had to experience certain things, the privations that every African has to go through. These are things that Beyoncé never experienced. And she's an American, but more than being an American, she is a very wealthy and, in fact, a pop icon. So in a sense, you could say that she might be disconnected from the everyday realities that even an average American experiences, to say nothing of an African. But the point is that she's trying to engage with Africa. Before now, people have had issues with African Americans who have tried to, maintain a kind of distance from Africa, deny their link with Africa. On the one hand, we have people like those who have to, who feel like denying their past, their link to Africa. And here we have someone who is trying to engage with Africa, of course, from our own perspective. It is a perspective that is necessarily limited by our experience of being an African-American woman and one who grew up in an environment very much different from the everyday environment of an African. So we have to realize this and try to make some accommodations for her on the grounds of that. And as I've said earlier on, she's not an intellectual. She is not an intellectual. We cannot expect from her the kind of thing we'll be expecting from, say, the likes of those are Pan-Africanist thinkers who had things to say about Africa beyond just merely using Africa as some kind of prop for capitalist engagements. So I think for now, I would just want to, to stop at this point and see, get further reactions on our own perspectives of Beyoncé. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rotimi. I think this is so far touched on so many really, really interesting things. I'd like to come back with my next question, because I think one thing that all three speakers have been speaking about or touched on is the question of representation, whether or not a Beyoncé is actually worthy of a critique, and what kind of a critique would she be worthy of. But going back to Rotimi, and I'll start with this because I think Fela Kuti is a good example, because compared to Beyoncé, Fela Kuti went to Ackwerh, I think it was 1967, which 67 as well. He blended high life with soul. Then he went to the US. He was inspired by the Black Panther Party. He was inspired by the African American scene, the musical scene. He came back and he started his own style. So a fella did this. He went, he traveled, he experienced, and then he came back and he fused all these things together. Is Beyoncé actually traveling, fusing, and bringing something that is, I mean, she is bringing something together, but is there a different style to which she's doing it? Because if you think about a fella, I mean, you know, he created his own style of music, which has repercussions until today. Is Beyoncé doing something similar, or is she different from this example? And I guess my question for all of you is, and going back to Pan-Africanism, because Nadine talked about the ventriloquist. What is happening in terms of where is Africa in this? What is represented and what is not? And Rotimi, you said you can't call her an intellectual and you can't blame her for that, but she uses kind of intellectual quotes and people, she draws on people to be able to create her songs and her videos. So I guess I want to pose this question to all three of you to think about the tensions between our expectations of Beyoncé, which is what, you know, we all spoke about, through a Pan-African lens, and what she actually brings to the table, what she actually gives us. If we can just go through one more round and perhaps think about it through what you've already said, but perhaps expand on what you've already said as well. So Nadine, I'll give you the first go.
Yeah, I mean, sure. To respond to that, obviously as a knee-jerk reaction, I would say that I don't think it's very dialogic at all, which is why I reverted to this idea of ventriloquism, because I think that comes through very clearly, which is interesting then, because as I said, it's almost as if the visual album is making an admission of its own artifice or a spectacle that is centered around the West. That doesn't necessarily have an interest in engaging with Africanness in the way I think we would either expect from a Pan-African perspective, or maybe just as ordinary African people listening in. But then also in saying that it draws on the artifice of animation and ventriloquism, I think as Africans watching then, it does, I think, creates a kind of discomfort in watching the spectacle unfold. So maybe just to concretize this point, I'll just refer to certain instances in the form of maybe like a close reading of the visual album. I think what struck me almost at the core when watching it is that when you look at African subjects in Black is King, you see that they're essentially silent and almost like a rigid ensemble. So when you look at the bodily movements, they're generally quite mechanized, automated, slow, sluggish, and even if we look at the stills of ordinary African characters, they're generally muted. But then they're almost animated with the voices, with external voices, right? Voices that belong to the mouths of other people. Sometimes their voices are substituted quite literally with the dubbed soundtrack of The Lion King. So there's this open admission that they're not talking as themselves, right? I think it's also quite telling that there's only one instance where an African subject does open their mouth, and that's in the Mood Forever sequence. And it's of little Simba. So he opens his mouth, and then again, very tellingly, only Jay-Z's voice comes out of his mouth. So we see that there's little acts of ventriloquism, like an open admission of animation that's happening during Black is King. So almost a very brutal and candid account of Africans not talking as themselves, of using this as a platform to talk about maybe the self. And if we think about the history of animation, I think this also becomes almost diabolical and weird. Then I think that's where the sense of conflict kicks in. Because if we think about ventriloquism, cartoons, animation, puppetry, they all have a very dark racial history, where we see that white performers have used it to animate not just the bodily movements of Black characters and their voices, but also to perpetuate very racist stereotypes about people of color. And so, you know, I think that's why cultural theorists say in contemporary times, there is an interesting sense of conflict that is built around the ventriloquist act. So if we think about, you know, theorists like, I think maybe Ray Chow and people like Sayen Ngai, where they argue that the ventriloquist act is this almost like a paradoxical space where it shows you the puppet and the puppeteer at the same time. So you're aware that there's a spectacle going on, but you're also complicit in it. And I think this is very clearly portrayed or I think highlighted in that sequence in My Power. Because here we see again that there's an awareness of the spectacle and the artifice, right? So it highlights the space of the gallery where there's this large white frame. And in this large white frame, we see Busiswa, which is a South African performer, and she's wearing a colorful costume. And this colorful costume then, you know, amplifies and exaggerates her buttocks and her bosom. And so in this way, it's very clearly referencing a Sarah Baartman figure. So we see that Black is King is highlighting this awareness of the kind of pedestal that Black women's bodies have been placed on historically. So it invites us to the show, so to speak, and showing us the show as a show. But then it does nothing with the kind of almost the tonal register of this moment, right? Because Sarah Baartman was a comic figure in the colonial exhibition space. And yet here, in this exaggerated, colorful costume, Black is King does nothing. It just invites us to the show and then makes us feel very uncomfortable in bearing witness to this as African subjects. So a very superficial sighting that, you know, I think leaves us questioning our ability to play with this and challenge this particular moment. And so that's why, you know, I think maybe my reading then becomes quite cynical in the sense that, you know, there is an awareness of artifice and an awareness that African subjects are being animated and they are in fact muted in this video, which then I think is, I think unstabling or unsettling. And that's why that moment, I think again in the Mood Forever sequence is interesting, because here we have Beyonce in a regal splendor, and she literally turns to the camera and she says something like, you know, flex, flex, flex. And then she's like, you can keep your struggle. So for me, that felt almost like an admission that, you know, a reminder almost to this impoverished continent that, quite frankly, this imaginative spectacle has nothing to do with us, really. That it is, in fact, a backdrop for a retelling of a different tale. And so, interestingly enough, you know, I think the only sovereign identity that is celebrated in the context of this entire visual album is the raising of the Black American flag, which I think is quite telling also. So again, another admission that this isn't an African story. Yeah.
So many things to think about. I want to, you know, the raising of the Black American flag, it reminds me of, because it's in the colors of red, black, and green in the song with Shatta Wale, and it's the Black nationalist flag designed by Marcus Garvey's UNIA in 1920, which first appeared in New York. But she does use that Pan-Africanist symbol to add another layer of cynicism to your analysis. You know, in Ghana, when it was the Gold Coast, you had this thing called concert a party theater. And so Ghanaian artists took this throughout Ghana. It was actually modeled from a kind of the kind of African-American blackface performances, but they never saw it as racist or a form of racism. They saw it as basically taking what was actually what they saw to be positive and admirable from the African-American culture and reappropriating it in some form in Ghana. So I think they're really, I want to think about the bi-directional nature of borrowing and taking and using. But I want to also move on to Judy Kael, because I think you raised a very important point about, and you quoted Chinua Achebe and his problem with Joseph Conrad's idea of, the dark continent. He was drawing on an already established popular imagination of Africa. He wasn't very original apart from how he told the story. And the Chinua Achebe is saying, we are people, right? So why don't you focus on that? So can you say a few more things as well now?
So I think what Chinua Achebe has been trying to tell us, and I mean as people who claim Pan-Africanism, even in the diaspora in the African continent, is that you have to try to engage the African continent outside of the white gaze. That is simply what he has been trying to tell us. And that has been the problem with us in the diaspora. And I put myself in, even though I was raised in Burundi, because there is this whole danger of when you are in the diaspora that you get so disconnected with what's happening on the African continent that you start viewing Africa through the eyes of the white gaze, to the point even your Pan-Africanism isn't even rooted on the African continent. So we have seen it. I mean, we are in 2020, but we have Pan-African who will stand on the pieces of thoughts from Kwame Nkrumah from 60 years ago without any critical context of what's happening on the African continent today, which means that what they are thinking of the African continent is what happened 60 years ago. So what happened during neocolonialism, they have no idea. So when they engage the African continent, it's as if there is no African continent after the continent gets its independence. So, and that bothers me a lot, because Pan-Africanism in the diaspora has been so much more rooted in the white gaze. It has been into defying the white. It's a power games that don't serve the continent. And that is also have been most Africans on the continent who are Pan-Africanists, that has been their worry. They have been saying, why do we offer our global solidarity to people in the diaspora and we meet them where they are? Why don't they meet us where we are? And that is the problem with Beyoncé. I mean, Beyoncé is a pop culture, yes, but it's not us who told her to go make a movie about lions, put Blackness and Africanness into it. Beyoncé is an artist. She could have done her thing with the lions and nobody would have bothered her. But she went and took our identities, our stories, and put into the movie that she invited all of us. It's as if she invited all of us into her house and we are seated, we are holding her accountable because it's our right. So, and Africans, we are allowed to be as free, as enjoying whatever ways we feel about this because we deserve it. But also because this has been a constant conversation that Africans get to be talked over every single day by people in the diaspora who share Blackness with them but have zero context on what's happening on the continent. And then at the end, we are told to be comfortable that actually someone in the diaspora is at least talking about us. So should then reduce Africa to the same ways the West deal with Africa, because Africa is always be told, you should be grateful that even though we start wars in your country, we still send you aid. It's the same white savior complex that even the diaspora gets to deal with the continent. So I think it's important that people in the diaspora who are Black truly analyze their power dynamics, truly rethink of what's decolonization and how do you engage with the continent. And the other thing about Beyoncé, we have to be honest. Beyoncé speaks of a language that most people in the diaspora use. That's how most people in the diaspora think of Africa. They think you would hear people, I've met people who would tell me, oh, I can't wait to move back to motherland. I'd be like, we have the same police. Why do you think I'm here? So the disconnect that makes you to fail to understand that the same way America is built on institutionalized racism, it's the same thing happening on Africa. So Africa isn't a paradise. People are dying. Africans are dying through the same chains that are killing minorities on America. So that disconnect, it's so dangerous. And Black is King also brings that. You may sit and watch Black is King and think Africa is a paradise. Then you will take a flight to Ghana. You get to Ghana, the police abuse you. But again, because you also, then there comes the power dynamics of being an American. So you won't be treated like a typical African the moment they realize that you have an American identity, which is true. Because the moment you get to have an American identity on the African continent, there is a social power that you get to carry. But those are conversations that also Black is King get us to have within our Pan-Africanism, that we have to also question our motives as people in the diaspora. How are we engaging our continent? And what are we allowing through Black is King to embody a part as struggles of the continent, as things that we want to relate on the continent. So yeah, so it's the disconnect for me. It's the disconnect that after watching Black is King, then I have to sit and ask myself, someone who has never been on the African continent, who doesn't know anything, what are they getting from this movie? What does it speak in their sense of belonging? So I would have loved, for me, I think I would have loved, and I think Beyoncé has that power. The same way Beyoncé has a power to turn a movie about Leon and then make it about Blackness. She can create a movie about and then tell the real stories of Africans that don't center the white gaze, because the danger here is the white gaze. What is the white gaze making us do? You understand? And what has the white gaze forced the diaspora to do towards the African continent? Has the diaspora been engaging the continent from a white savior complex ways of dealing with the continent, or are we dealing with the continent by trying to decolonize what we think about the continent? Because the moment you understand that as part of you are part of the US machine, you are a part of a whole agenda, imperialist agenda against the African continent, regardless of if you are Black. So the way you deal with the African continent, it's so rooted in Americanism. So it's your responsibility to decolonize. It's your responsibility to listen to Pan-African on the continent. It's your responsibility to read less of Nkrumah, of course read Nkrumah, but also try to connect on what's going on the continent. So you're critical thinking about the African continent. Is it before independence? But what happened and has been happening on the continent up to now. So Beyoncé, I think Beyoncé has to do more. She has to do more. She has the power to do more.
Sorry, I was still on mute. Very powerful words. And there's a lot of discussion happening right now. So as soon as I pass it, I'm going to pass it on to Rotimi. We're going to go into these conversations that's happening in the Q&A, because there's a lot of response. There's also my question, just to push back, because I think that I'm trying to look at the questions that are coming and trying to take some of them. And some of these questions are about, which actually come from when Beyonce's mother, Tina Knowles-Carter, was being interviewed. She says that Beyonce cannot appropriate a culture when she is a part of the culture that she is Black. So what they are doing is not taking and not, what they're doing is basically reconnecting. So the question of also art and how art is a way to start a conversation, it does not necessarily give you everything, but it is a way to create a connection and leave room for conversations like this to be reinterpreted, to have dialogue, and to actually think about what she's not doing and what she can do better. So I'm just taking from some of the questions. We'll come back to these questions in the dialogue. Rotimi, you have the last word before we go on to taking some of these questions and posing them to all of you. You mentioned that we need to be aware of the context in which she's coming from. And I'd like you to expand on what you think you benefited from watching Black is King. It's a beautiful piece of art. And so I think we all agree on that. So what is it that you took from it? How did you feel when you saw certain Yoruba icons, rituals, deities being both kind of made into icons in this?
Thank you. What Black is King, I should say, is full of references, quotations of different types. But the point is that these quotations are not explored in any detail. They are just there, like some kind of backdrop. Hearing Yoruba and some other African languages in that film may give one a sense of, well, it is interesting to see that. But beyond that interest, we have to ask ourselves, what's next after this? What exactly is Beyoncé trying to achieve? And I should also add, beyond the fact that we are talking of Beyoncé as an individual, she has the platform, she has the power, the economic power. And of course, as a pop culture icon, she's someone up there that everyone, looks up to, many people look up to. But the question still needs to be asked. But for the fact that this is Beyoncé, would we be talking about Black is King? What exactly is that in Black is King? I think it's generated so much interest because it's coming from Beyoncé. And as I keep saying, Beyoncé is not an intellectual, she's not a thinker. Above everything else, she's a capitalist trying to market a product. And to the extent that she's talking about Africa, I think it is important that we engage her at that level. Of course, she does not have any rights to, she doesn't have the rights to present Africa in any manner she feels like. We should question her, we should hold her to account, precisely because of the platform, the very important platform she occupies. She could do better. But in the absence of her doing better, we should take the bits that she's been able to do and make the best of it. And I want to compare Beyoncé again. I want to go back to my comparison between Beyoncé and Fela. One artist made a conscious attempt to know more about Africa. Fela was not always the same Fela that we eventually came to know. He was just like the Beyoncé kind of character, someone, a happy-go-lucky young man who was about living his life, playing music. But he had a transformative experience after he went abroad. And it's important that we take note of this because a lot of what we talk about Pan-Africanism and indeed, yes, Pan-Africanism came from the African diaspora in their quest to engage with the African continent, the experiences of the people back in Africa. So the point here is this. While in the case of Fela, there was that conscious attempt to know more about Africa, to understand where Africa started, where Africa was coming from, or to put it in an Ashebe balance, where the rain began to beat us. That is not the same for Beyoncé. Fela made a conscious attempt to move out of his own class, a middle-class Nigerian, where within the colonial setting, one who was, whose family carried a lot of name recognition. He moved out of that, was playing music at a time when many of in his own economic background were into the professions, medicine, law, and what have you. He moved out to play music. And at some point, not just any kind of music, not music about love, not music about making money or wearing the latest jewelry. It's music about transforming Africa. And he was not only mouthing this music, he was out there leading groups, individuals, forming political parties, moving from one campus to another, speaking to the youth, trying to engage with the Africans on the continent, continental Africans, and those in the diaspora. He got his experience, took what he could from different parts of the world, and then came back to redefine his music, adopted a balance that was, the language of the ordinary people in Africa, in Nigeria, pidgin English, in order to connect with them. What is the language? What language does Beyoncé speak? It is the language of economics, of capitalism. It is not the language of someone who is actually out there to empower Africa in the sense in which we would expect an African on the continent to do. Of course, people say so much about Black is King being empowering and whatnot. But I think there is a limit to how far we can talk about the level of empowerment that comes from this kind of depictions of Africans we have in Black is King. To a certain level, it is empowering, at least to the level that Beyoncé was willing to go. But we must, as some of my co-panelists have been mentioning, we must question her, we must hold her to account. But while holding her to account, we must recognize her limitations, recognize where she is coming from. Black is King, as projected by Beyoncé, is about spectacle. It's about showing, you will see the costume change, moving from one to the other. You could even, you don't have enough time to even, before you've internalized one, something else is there. It's about showing you the different things, different pictures, and you're asking yourself, what is this all about? Is this the everyday reality of Africans? It is not. But we can't continue to wring our hands and just condemn this wholesale. We have to take the bits that she's been able to offer. Ultimately, it is Africans who must take responsibility for themselves. Of course, by talking about Africans, I'm not just talking about continental Africans, even those in the diaspora. They must engage, because there are others in the diaspora as well who do not have the kind of name recognition that Beyoncé has, who are doing a lot. But because of who Beyoncé is, we are all compelled to talk about her. Of course, she has a responsibility, and she must recognize that she has a role to play beyond just trying to show us the beautiful part of, the point you have to note about this, the Africans in the diaspora, is that they have this bipolar view of Africa. It is either that Tarzanic Africa, the Africa of the wilds, where you see people moving from trees to trees, jumping from one tree to another, or the Africa of royalty. These are two extremes that do not necessarily, but of course they are part of Africa, but they do not necessarily reflect the everyday existence, experiences of Africans. So let us take note of these things. And in taking note of them, let us recognize what type of expectations we put on some of these iconic figures. We have some of them here in Nigeria. Even in the video of Black is King, the film itself, how does Beyoncé relate with the other artists from different parts of Africa? She's like the mother figure, the big figure there who has brought together everyone. It's like conferring name recognition on the others, consecrating them. The very fact that they've appeared on the same, in the same space with Beyoncé is a lot for them. And you find in other parts of Africa, people questioning the fact that they've been excluded. Those in East Africa want to be included in that. And you ask yourself, what has Beyoncé said that Fela hasn't said, that Lucky Dube hasn't said, or even Bob Marley did not, I've not spoken about in more eloquent way. So we're only talking about Beyoncé because it is Beyoncé. And when you look at the level with which, the manner Beyoncé is being treated these days, almost bordering on reverence, then you will understand why we shouldn't place too much capital on on our intellectual abilities. We should just recognize that she is an artist. We have artists like that in Nigeria. They sing, they perform. Even Burna Boy, who appeared in that video, he's more or less someone moving in the footsteps of Fela Kuti. But the point also is that, is he ready to do the same things that Fela did? Is he ready to go beyond just merely singing, living in posh areas in Nigeria, here in Lagos? Fela did all of that. So I think I keep on insisting that we have to put some of these things in context and recognize the limitations of this. Of course, Beyoncé has a responsibility to Africans. So the extent that she chooses to engage with the narratives of Africa, we must hold her to account. But where she has fallen short of our expectations, we should just learn to accept it and, of course, move on from there.
Thanks very much, Rotimi. We're going to move on to the questions now. This has been an amazing conversation, by the way. I want to, again, just to say thank you before we move on to the Q&A to our panelists, because you've had wonderful feedback and comments. Can I just say, firstly, where is Burna Boy in Beyonce's video? He's the only artist who's not actually physically featured. Did he refuse to be on the visual album? And he just launched his own album yesterday. Yes. Anyway, but just to, I guess I was just like, I'm a big fan of Burna Boy, so I had to say that. But my question comes from some of the comments. And some of the comments I want to just to read you to so that you can see what's happening. You can even look at it yourself and pick something if you find it interesting for you to respond to. But one of the things, Rotimi, that you said that people object to is that maybe the idea that artists are not also kind of intellectuals. And I have to say, Bright, who's a friend of mine, and he's also an artist in Ghana, and he thinks that, of course, artists are intellectuals, or they use the intellectual resources in order to create their art. And Beyonce's art is, I would say, is informed by many different ideas that she draws on. So this is just a comment. You can feel free to respond later to that. And one more thing that I was thinking about, that's a question by Cassandra Ose. Would a better comparison for Beyonce be Michael Jackson? Michael Jackson, 1992, I think, he came up with this video, Remember the Times, and the video itself was with a kind of, I think it was Eddie Murphy and a model from Africa. And there was this kind of Egyptian, use of basically Egypt. And even Beyonce does use the Nile and Egypt is in my blood and all that a lot. Would that be a better comparison than comparing her to, let's say, Fela or someone like that? Another question I want to pose, and I'll pose a few questions. You can choose whatever you want to respond to. Some of the pushback as well, or at least the questions, is that people agree that they find Black is King problematic. Let's say Aroda, while I find that Black is King is problematic, I don't agree that Beyonce does not have the right to represent Africa. I think African artists display Africa in so many ways that I don't feel is also appropriate. African men make rubbishly videos that degrade African women in so many ways. That we have a double standard. Nollywood is notorious for negative depiction of African religions and casting aspersion on African spirituality. So Africans coming down so hard on Beyonce, I think, is unfair. We must welcome her incursions where we are allowed to criticize her contributions. But saying she has no right to appropriate African culture, I don't agree with. So I'll leave it for now with these few comments and questions. And would you like to respond? Perhaps Nadine, you go first and we'll take it again.
Yeah, sure. Just to follow on from your last comments, I think that's where I would sit with an artifact like Black is King, because I don't think there is any kind of monolithic response that the African continent can offer. I think that's also a dangerous trap to fall into. So, I mean, for me, the middle ground is to acknowledge that, as Rotimi pointed out, this is in fact a capitalistic product. And I don't think Beyonce has pretended to be any other kind of performer. So to argue that there is a world in which many people practice art in different ways is something I think we should be more open to. That there are pop culture icons who are more capitalistic and others that are more inclined towards activism is in fact true, and I think it will always be the case. So we can't hold all pop culture icons and all pop culture to that particular standard. I think that's unrealistic just in terms of the way pop culture works and circulates. So as you said, someone pointed out that Nollywood is equally as trashy, and that's true. It recycles African culture in very superficial and even denigratory ways. So I think we should be open to that as a kind of cultural conversation. And maybe that's where this dynamic of a Pan-African dialogism comes into play, that we can in fact acknowledge also that the African continent produces our own great musicians and our own video spectacles, and that as commentators we can critique something like Black is King, and that there is a conversation that happens there. Because I think, also something that I wanted to raise, that, I mean, there is a tendency to say that Beyoncé should be held accountable. But I mean, beyond the extent of us critiquing, allowing for, and then critiquing something like Black is King, how much further can a pop culture icon go? How much more can we expect? And yeah, in saying that, I think in closing, the last thing that I wanted to raise was that in this last wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, what became so poignant and telling for me was that in the streets of Africa, like, they weren't necessarily protests that matched the numbers that we saw in the global north. And so when we talk about, this Pan-African conversation, as Judy Kayal mentioned, that there is maybe a disconnect that needs to be addressed there. And I think that conversation goes well beyond Beyoncé. I think she's only reflective of a kind of cultural conversation. And maybe that's something that all good capitalistic pop icons do, is that they very, very opportunistically can tap into a cultural moment. And that cultural moment is about this disconnect, maybe, where Africans can use their voice and go, well, if you're having this Black Lives Matter moment, to what extent are we included in this conversation? And on the African continent, that was met largely with silence. And I think that's very telling.
Thank you, Nadine. There is the question of Black Lives Matter in the African continent. I can speak for Ghana. It was definitely, there was a movement, but there were two movements. One that was appropriated by the country, by the government, in a very neoliberal fashion, and one that was actually came from the ground, which was pointing to Black lives in Ghana and the police brutality in Ghana. Like was mentioned earlier, that there is police brutality, and so on in countries in Africa. So the point is, it wasn't as large as in the global north, for sure. Judy, would you like to respond to some of these things?
I think for me, it's something that I have even written in the article. I don't believe Beyoncé can appropriate African cultures. It is hard for someone to appropriate their roots, but I also believe, as an African descent, Beyoncé truly has every right to find her belonging to the African continent. But as I said, African continent isn't a monolith. It's made of different traditions. It's made of different cultures, different tribes, different ethnies. So people part of those ethnies have the right words on how they deal with what Beyoncé is using to tap into her belonging to the land. That's why personally, I don't have any comments to give on the African spirituality ways that Beyoncé used, because it's not something that is typical to Burundi. But I know my Yoruba friend, who is very spiritual, had some critiques about that. And I welcome those critiques. But also I think for me, my requirement to Beyoncé is her being aware of her power. Someone just said that all these critiques wouldn't exist towards Rihanna because Rihanna has never made music claiming to be a political activist, but Beyoncé does it. Basically, Beyoncé, she chooses to capitalize from our struggles, which means she invites all of us into her music and to criticize it. And then I think there's a disconnect because she's not aware of her social power. She's not aware of her economic power. And maybe she produced all this music about her struggles from the good intentions of creating music for us. But at the end of the day, because she's not part of our everyday struggles, she kind of harms us in the mix of it. She kind of participates in the Western gaze. She kind of, she kind of just gets to be a capitalist, and then people come for her. So because I've heard many comments, many conversations on why Beyonce is always attacked and not Rihanna. And then at the end of the day, you have to understand that Rihanna has never done any songs about Black Panther. Rihanna has never gave us Black is King. Rihanna is minding her business. She just chose to talk about her issues that matters, but she just out there minding her business. So I feel like I'm not saying that Beyonce shouldn't do all of this for us. I'm just saying that once she decides to do this for us, then maybe she has to do it the right way. And we are asking the right way because, and then I think for me, what bothers me is the idea that we have to take anything that is given to us. No, I don't think we are so desperate for representation that as Africans, we should take anything given to us. Isn't what white supremacy did to us? To convince us that we needed so much of civilization that we have to take it even if it means being colonized. I mean, it's the same narrative. So I don't think we should get to that point. I don't think we should saying, oh, it doesn't matter what Beyonce is doing as long as she's talking about Africa. No, we have to cross. Chinua Achebe has talked about it. We are people. We deserve dignity. We have to cross around taking every crumble thrown on us because we so much desire representation. I think those are my thoughts for me.
Thank you. You know, Beyonce said in a speech for all the high school graduates that because there's no seat at the table for someone like her. Or for people who are seen to be marginalized, you have to go out, chop the wood, build your own table. And then I was participating, I was a participant or observing a virtual conference yesterday by the Black radical feminists. So basically women from Africa who were talking about this idea of a table. And they were saying, why do we even need a table? Because once you sit on the table, it's going to be a patriarchal, white supremacist, neoliberal table. So we don't want a table. Let's just all sit on the floor. So this whole idea that I think there's an important question. Even if you create your own table, you create your own stage, what are you reproducing? So the quick points there. I want to go on to Rotimi, and I want to ask a question that Nikoi has asked as well, because he's also someone that I know, and he's asking a question about. Well, I'm not just asking because I know him, but because it's a good question. Are we not engaging too much in textualism? I find that it's important to also look at the mechanics of cultural production, the cultural workers, and the practices of distribution and circulation. So the streaming on Disney, DSTV, online. Then we can also, we can also interrogate the asymmetries of voice. So you have, I don't know whether you read this, a New York Post article, Burna Boy's album launched. And the New York Post says in the title, Beyonce's endorsed Burna Boy has launched an album. So not Burna Boy has launched an album, but Beyonce's endorsed Burna Boy. So now Burna Boy is only Burna Boy because somehow someone else has endorsed him. Of course, he will not agree with that. But so the question of who speaks, who is heard, the asymmetries of voice in the cultural production. I'll leave you to answer anything you want to say, whatever you want. Rotimi, you have the stage now.
Thank you. I think in my closing remark, the last time I spoke, I mentioned this in brief. The very fact that the other artists from Africa are more or less like in the background. Beyoncé is the star. So she's projected as the star, and everyone else are just like stars around her. Around her, lesser stars. And what is happening there, of course, reflects the kind of criticism that many have had about the asymmetries of power between the West and Africa in terms of how African cultural products are valued. Many times, African artists look towards the West for validation. They want to get the Grammy. They want to get the Emmys or what have you. And when they go there, what happens? They are in the background. They are giving awards and they're not allowed to come on stage. And you find that even playing out here in terms of how even the African artists who performed with Beyoncé on a album are seen as having quote and unquote arrived. They've been consecrated by the almighty Beyoncé. And the only reason we have this type of thing is because of the political situation around, I mean, in the world, the very fact that you have an American society that projects its economic and political power on its artists. And from there, you see them, you know, the hegemony is just there, which allows an American artist to dictate the pace at which things are going. They can choose to look at you and they can choose to ignore you. So you find a situation where an African artist, say like a Burna Boy, who is quite proud of himself, who is so conscious of his Africanness and is ever ready to project it, being put, of course, is yet to get to that global recognition that Beyoncé has. But this is someone who is sure of his own art, performing in his own right, but who now has to get the validation of Beyoncé for his own album, right? But this is only possible because of the position that Beyoncé occupies. She is a product of capitalism. And today, even though she's that product of capitalism and everyone sees her as a success case, but we never can tell what can happen tomorrow. What Beyoncé is experiencing today, Michael Jackson experienced in the past. And then suddenly everything came crashing. We don't know what could happen tomorrow. The Beyoncé that that is being celebrated by the capitalist world today and is being projected to the rest of the world, who is being expected to champion causes that she never even envisaged for herself, or she's taking the opportunities presented to her by the fact of her global reckoning to do things that ordinarily she wouldn't even want to do. So we find our African artists who want to identify with her. And she also wants to see herself as that iconic figure who is able to provide a platform for the rest of Africans, artists, fashion designers, whatever it is, you know, small businesses. They want to appear on her website. They want to get her recognition, all because of who she is or who she's been made to become. But I think it's about time that African artists themselves, in the like of a Fela Kuti, take a stand, articulate their vision of Africa, and whether or not Beyoncé or any other African-American artist or even a white American artist endorses them or not, let them stand firm. Let them hold firm to whatever it is, their own vision of Africa. They don't have to subscribe to whatever vision is being sold to them by a Beyoncé. They should be confident in their own skin. And once they are able to do this, we won't be worrying ourselves too much about what Beyoncé does or does not do. I think I'll stop at that.
Wow. Okay, so I just want to say that there are more questions coming through, but because we have 15 minutes left in our panel, I want to also give all three of you a few more minutes each to wrap up some thoughts, some ideas that you might want to share, so you can say a few, but I want to also share some of the comments that are coming up. So I think when we talk about Beyoncé being capitalistic, I think there are many forms or ways in which capitalism can manifest. And one of them, I think it was Bright who said that she's not a Rihanna in the sense that she's a capitalist, but she wants to be someone who is an activist or a political leader. She wants to change things in her own way. She's not just writing songs to sell these songs, but she's also writing songs to send a message, right? And whether you want to call it a political message or not. Is it more dangerous or is it better? That's just a question. My thoughts as well from a few of the other panel questions is that somehow when you think about collaboration between the African artists and a Beyoncé, the African artists don't mind the exposure. And this is from Nana Ackwerh and Yudoho. Thank you very much for that. The comment. They don't mind the exposure. It's a good thing. It's when, I'm reading what she said, it's when others assume that they didn't exist prior to this Columbus-esque discovery. So it's not that they need to be discovered, but when the spotlight shines on them, do they actually benefit? They do. When Blitz, the ambassador who was from Ghana, who was a hip hop artist in Ghana, he went to the States he moved to New York, and he became this kind of international figure who also made a film, the Burial of Kojo, which is now on Netflix. He was picked to be one of the co-directors. A lot of her directors and co-directors are somehow linked to the African continent. So there are collaborations that span from her dancers, you know, the guy from Nigeria who is like everywhere, the guy in blue. How is this? This is also a good thing, isn't it? I mean, I'm asking the question. In some way, she's allowed them to launch their own careers and to do whatever they want with their careers. So I will stop talking. I'll let the three of you wrap up. Few final words. You don't have to say that you love Beyoncé in these few final words, but just to what you want to leave us with. Thank you very much. I'll just let Nadine go.
Yeah, so just to respond to the comment about how capitalism allows for certain, I think, access to modes of cultural circulation, I thought that was a very important point, because I think that's precisely, if we break down this conversation to the nuts and bolts of it, that's where the problem lies. Because it's not to say that Africa is this cultural desert, but the only problem is that we don't have the capital and the cultural clout that Beyoncé has. We don't have that kind of machinery, so therefore we don't get the same amount of exposure. And so then someone, as you mentioned, said that, well, then isn't that a good thing? Because here we have Beyoncé inviting people to use her platform. But then I think there is, again, another distinction that we can make here. And maybe your analogy of the table comes into play here. Because here we have Beyoncé, I think Rotimi also mentioned this, she's inviting people onto her stage, which I think there's a marked difference between inviting someone onto your platform, and then alternatively, which is maybe something we could argue that Rihanna does, which is then building a stage or a platform for other people to emerge from. Because as you mentioned, on the one hand, we could say, yeah, it's great, and no one's going to say no to getting a gig from Beyoncé, and I don't think anybody can. That's just the power of cultural capital. I don't think I would refuse a gig from Beyoncé either, right? It's just culturally, it's I think, unimaginable in our neoliberal capitalistic times. Yeah, and so I think someone said that that's a good thing, right? So surely the artists are happy with the platform that Beyoncé has given them. So why should we be so critical about it? But I think we're not, I think, calculating the kind of hidden costs that are involved in that transaction, because it isn't an equal exchange. It isn't purely dialogic in that sense. Because and oftentimes you also see this with literature, especially in Afropolitan literature, for example. If I were to sell my novel to a US company, there's a lot of dilution and watering down that I would have to do in my rendition of Africa in order to make that novel a sellable product in the US and for a US market. So I think someone also mentioned in passing Trevor Noah. I think that's also another cultural example of when you do in fact cross over to a US market, there is a price that you pay. I don't think it's any small coincidence that once he started presenting The Daily Show, he starts referring to Africa in this very unspecific and almost caricatural way. You know, Africa that is full of dictators who are all buffoons. So I think there is a price to pay. Yes, you get a platform, but you don't necessarily get to perform as yourself authentically, I think, as you would choose to in utilizing that platform.
Wow.
Thank you.
What are my final thoughts? Well, I think everything else that I wanted to say, everyone has said it. But I think for me, it's an invitation to actually rethink of what do we want to take from an art that claims our identity. So what do we want to think of it? How do we imagine it? How do we cross over those imaginations? And also, how do we demand more for ourselves? Because, I mean, for me, I'm transitioning from being told that this is what you get and you should be comfortable, and in asking more. And yes, as I said, Black is King is so rich and so powerful, and Beyoncé did her best to collaborate with a range of artists, a range of fashion designers. We appreciate that, but there is more, and I'm demanding more, as I'm demanding more for myself. And I'm demanding more because our African continent deserves more. I'm demanding more because once you claim that you are doing something for the continent, then you have to do more. There is so much more you have to do, and Beyoncé has the capability to do more.
Very powerful words from the both of you. Rotimi, don't be shy.
Yes. Beyoncé has provided cultural capital for the African artists she's invited to collaborate with her. And I think these artists have done well for themselves. Let them take possession of the platform and move on from there to make of it what they want, not relying on Beyoncé or the capitalist system to dictate for them what should happen thereafter. Beyoncé has done a bit, and well, to the extent that she's done a bit, she could be praised for that. But let us not expect too much from her beyond what she is willing to give. Otherwise, we might as well Beyoncé if she has to go beyond a particular level in trying to become activists. They often pay for it. Beyoncé is a good poster child of American capitalism. And the African artists who have had to collaborate with her should take the opportunity they have for the moment and thereafter move on to do things for themselves. Thank you.
So in these final minutes, can you hear me? In these final minutes, I just want to allow for a few words to say thank you to all my panelists, because I must say that there were a few minutes where I wasn't sure whether you would even be able to show up given problems with the internet or so on. And so I'm glad that all of you are here because you have contributed to this panel in ways that I think even I did not imagine. So I think this has been an important conversation, partly because as much as if you think about Pan-Africanism, it's a bi-directional dialogue that as much as it was started in the diaspora, you know, Pan-Africanism was also assented in the African continent. We think of Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré and all these people. And we have to always remind ourselves of this bi-directional connection and not just think about it as coming from one, but that there is a power relationship here. And collaboration, I think, as much as we use that word, we have to acknowledge that the collaboration has a power dynamic. So conversation is not between two people who are equal. And Beyoncé, you know, she must also be aware of this. And if not, she should be aware of this. So we need to say, firstly, thank you to our panelists. I will invite everyone who have turned off their videos to turn on their videos and to give a round of applause to our three panelists, Nadine, Judy, and Rotimi. Thank you so much. You've been an amazing group of people to have this conversation with.
Thank you.
And for all of you who are here, thank you so much for showing up. I can see some of you, and I will look forward to seeing you in the future again on more of these. But I think this brings it to an end, and I will see you all in some form, shape, or form in the future. Yomida Sewai. Thank you.
Thank you.